So, Tim, in our last episode, we shared a conversation with Christopher Michaelson, the co-author of Is Your Work Worth It? How to Think About Meaningful Work. And it's about the implications of either giving a lot or a little meaning to your work. And we really liked the book and the conversation that we had.
Yeah, well, we liked it so much that we wanted to hear from Christopher's co-author, Jen Totsi-Kharas. So we invited her onto the show. And just to tell you a little bit about Jen, she is a professor of organizational behavior at Babson College. She teaches organizational behavior and leadership in the undergraduate, graduate, and executive programs. And she partnered with Christopher on this important book because it's important to think about how we think about our work.
Yeah. It was very interesting to get the perspective of two authors about the same book. Now, in the past, we've had multiple authors on before, but they've always been in the same interview.
Right.
And this time we split them out. And where Christopher's perspective on the topic was, I don't know, Tim, would you say philosophical?
Well, yeah. I mean, he's a philosopher. So
okay. So
yeah.
duh, right? Yeah. All right. But with Jen, she brought a different perspective and it was very research based. Mm-hmm. And that's where we're going to focus on in this call today.
Yeah. As we discovered in our conversation with Christopher, the ideas behind defining your work as just a job or a career or as a calling, they're actually pretty nuanced. And in this conversation with Jen, we're going to dig a little bit deeper because she helped us focus on how pursuing a calling can have its downsides. Like callings can lead to overcommitment and burnout. And pursuing callings or dream jobs can actually kind of disconnect us from the realities that we might face in the arc of our lives.
Right. But there's another side to callings, an upside. If you feel like your work is a calling, it can lead to increased engagement and better life satisfaction. That's important. And failing to pursue a strong calling can also lead to some psychological damaging elements leading to feelings of frustration, regret, and failure. So this idea of simply following your passion is by no means a straightforward path, right? It has its upsides and its downside. It's, I don't know, Tim, would you say it's kind of tricky? You know? Yeah. In some ways, this story about love your job and you'll never work a day in your life is maybe a bit of a stretch. Or for some, like you, Tim, it might be a total lie, right? So we need to be thoughtful about how we treat our dreams and our work.
Yeah. Okay. So back to Jen. She's done a lot of her research on this whole job, career, calling spectrum with professional and amateur musicians. So in this conversation, she shares a lot of her work comparing orchestral musicians to, guess what? Federal prison guards.
Okay, that sounds a little crazy at first, don't you think?
It is a little crazy, but what she found is that while musicians report stronger callings, sort of intuitively, they are less satisfied with their work than prison guards. This has a lot to do with expectations, but I think we're just going to leave it there and let people listen to the episode and hear how Jen explains that.
You hooked me. I want to know what did we say? What do we talk about? That why prison guards are more satisfied with.
You'll have to listen to the episode, Kurt.
Professional musicians. Oh my God. Okay. Well, with that, welcome to Behavioral Grooves. I'm Kurt Nels.
You are. You're Kurt Nels.
Oh my God, we are so close. All right, I'm going to do this here. Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. I'm Kurt Nelson. We encourage you to take the challenge to think more deeply about the role of work in your life and the trade-offs involved in pursuing your deepest callings.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. And we hope that right now you can sit back and relax with a warm early autumn cup of callings and enjoy our conversation with Jen Totsi-Kharas.
It's kind of late fall, Tim. Not early autumn.
Depends on where you live.
How does autumn change by where you live? Anyway.
Jen Totsi-Kharas, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you so much, Tim. I'm so happy to be here.
We are very excited to talk to you today because we have some really cool stuff to bring together. And we have to start with something that's going to get us going. Coffee or tea?
Coffee all day.
Okay. All day.
All day.
This is not just a morning, like, get me going piece.
No.
It is.
No, I am a big believer in, as my friends say, 3:00 is just about when I usually need that next injection. And people are, especially, I don't know, I feel like as I've reached middle age, people are always like, I can't have caffeine after some time, which is usually like pretty early in the afternoon. And I'm like, nope, can have it after dinner, can have it like nothing keeps me up, actually. So
it's funny. My mom used to drink coffee at dinner, after dinner, and slept like a baby. I cannot do that. I just not me. But yeah, I know those people. All right. Second speed round question. If you could have a superpower for an hour, what would that superpower be?
Oh my gosh, I love that so much. It's funny. I've heard you ask this before, and I was trying to think in advance, like what would I do if you asked me this question?
I think we asked your co-author this one. So I think we asked Michael this one. Yeah. So.
No, I think I would, teleport myself to some. What would it be? I would teleport myself to some amazing, beautiful setting, and have magically the ability to produce some like delicious meal, maybe like an amazing coffee would be part of that. And still, manage to get home in time to do all my parent stuff at the end of the day. That would probably be the superpower I would most want, like a perfect hour somewhere.
I love that, actually, because you've just got it for an hour, and why not indulge? It's not like you're spending the rest of your life. Just indulge for a little bit.
Exactly. If it were permanent, by the way, I would have said, cure the world, world peace, help everybody.
But you can't do that in an hour.
That's for me.
You can't do that in an hour. I mean, I'm just going to go do this in an hour, and then I come back for my kids, and there you go. No? Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Third speed round question. Would you prefer to have dinner with your favorite actor or favorite musician?
Oh, musician.
Just good answer. So first, I'm just going to give you the 2 thumbs up on well done. But does anybody come to mind?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm going to have dinner with Tori Amos.
Ooh.
Wow.
I like Tori.
Cool.
Giving away probably my age and all these other demographics. But I'm going to have dinner with Tori Amos. Maybe that's also where the superpower comes in, and we're having this amazing, meal together in some beautiful location. But I think part of the reason that I said musician, and specifically Tori Amos, or someone like her compared to an actor, is, to me, the musician is the creator. So the musician is writing their lyrics, composing their music. I mean, I think with Tori Amos's music in particular, and some of the music I'm drawn to, just the stories behind the songs, the personal connection, often linked to broader, societal issues, things like that. It's what an interesting person to talk to. Versus, I often think actors are, they're not the directors. Like, I'd rather talk to a director of a film or a TV show or the showrunner or something, the creator, than the actor who's the famous face, but is essentially, delivering. So I guess that's also the difference between, I'm drawn to musicians who aren't like studio creations, where their music is written for them and they're just the front person. So to me, an actor is more that than a musician, almost by definition, though I know there are exceptions.
Yeah. Tori Amos' Little Earthquakes got me through a really bad time in like a breakup that was horrible. And I remember that was my go-to. I just put that on, and it helped me through a very bad time in my life. So there you go. She'd be fantastic to talk to.
Thank you, Tori.
Yeah.
I feel like I discovered her music also in my adolescence, which was like just when I needed it. I needed that message at that time. And still, I'll hear her music. She's sort of still relevant, but it's making its way back into like movies and TV shows that I'm watching. And I'm thinking, yes.
She is such a fantastic pianist as well. I mean, it is amazing when you listen to the way that she works that keyboard. It's just amazing. All right. We could go on and on. This is usually Tim's part of the show where he gets in all about the music, but there we go.
I've got Tori Amos stories, but
all right. Well, hey, Tim, we have these two last options for these questions. The last speed round question. Should I go with the first option or the second option? What do you think?
Oh, man. Oh, you're going to put me on the spot?
Should we super speed them and do both? I mean, let's do it both.
Maybe.
I
will ask the second one,
and both and it.
You can say, I want the first one, and so I'm going with the second one, and you can say, nope, I'm not going to answer that. I want the first one. So, here it is.
This is like being on a game show.
Yeah, there you go. Do orchestral musicians generally have a higher work satisfaction than federal prison guards?
Oh my gosh. I want to hear the first question.
All right. First question.
Okay.
I love it.
A lot of people talk about having a calling to do some particular vocation. Is a calling a real thing, or is it just some sort of woo-woo sort of explanation for something that isn't real?
I love it. I'm going to try to find a way to answer both. I like how you said woo woo. This is great. It would be so funny if I sat here and said, yep, it's just a woo woo. It's just a nice, feels great, makes you.
We kind of figured you might go a different direction with that, but we weren't sure.
Just a total fabrication.
Yeah.
No, so my research, is built on understanding the experience of work as a calling, which is very much a not only real phenomenon to people, but also a driving force behind their career decision making. So it exists in the minds of the people doing the work, but that does not make it, as you well know, as hosts of this podcast, purely in their minds. It drives a lot of their motivation to do their work, their ability to show up and do their work, how they show up at work. And the way that they, especially in the early years, try to establish themselves within their careers. And I guess I'll say just briefly, trying to have it both ways. When you asked about the prison guards versus the orchestral musicians, so along with my co-author, Shasa DeBrow, who is herself a orchestral bassoonist in addition to being a professor of organizational behavior at the London School of Economics. Okay. And very interesting person. Though being a professional musician seems like a dream job, orchestral musicians are surprisingly not satisfied with their work compared to prison guards, in large part because much of what you picture when you are drawn to music, certainly the performance aspect, but also the novelty, the creativity, maybe being in front of people like a Tori Amos, where you're the only one on the stage. A lot of that does not apply to orchestral musicians. So sure, they're performing and doing it at a high level and with other talented people and as part of an ensemble, but you're playing the same hits that people want to hear and not necessarily your own music or even the music you would choose. It's like any other job, right? It can feel like a grind. And so that's I think a surprising finding, but I think that's illuminating of the career paths of people who experience a strong calling toward music.
I just want to say kudos to you for just pulling those two questions together. Bravo. Well done.
Thank you. Both and. Whenever possible, I try to both and it. So.
All right. That's good. So I think it's interesting, though. Can we just stay with this idea of orchestral musicians and not having this great satisfaction? Because it is a day-to-day job. It is about really putting a lot of time in on rehearsing specific pieces. It's not just playing whatever the hell you want, anytime you want. I get to do that, but they don't. They've got to, and they have to perform at a very high level. So it's not just being familiar with a piece. It's hard work. And yet there's also great examples of orchestral musicians having vivid callings, right?
Yeah.
So how does that dichotomy work?
Well, I think that, as I like to say, in any line of work, even the most meaningful work that's the strongest calling that you can imagine, and on one hand, you're so lucky to be doing it, no work feels meaningful or perfectly satisfying every day, day in
Mm.
and day out. So the generalized finding is that over time, callings toward a field decrease. And I think it's partly the honeymoon wears off, the reality of the work sets in, monotony can set in. And so certainly the arts is a prototypical calling type of occupation. It's like the helping professions. And these are both areas that we understand people have strong desires, strong motivations to perform, believing engagement in the arts is often you exhibit a talent at a young age, you're encouraged by it, you look up to, you have some exemplar in your mind about what it means to have made it. I mean, if you are someone who plays an orchestral type of instrument, that would probably be the highest tier you could go is playing in a professional orchestra. And yet it is from the outside. So from the perspective of all the people trying to get into that organization, you see it as like, how could you be there in this coveted, so few people actually make it
Right.
and be anything less than fully satisfied. But yet it's like any other job, there's ways in which the reality of the work and just the, experience over time can get a bit diminished. And rather than, I think we could all see that as being horribly depressing, maybe like even, the people we hold up in our minds as being these like pillars of our field are not totally satisfied every day. But I think it's also a reality. One of the things I would love to do through my work is to give people a little bit of a reality check about experiencing a strong calling, that it's not, we hold it up as this end all be all. Like we have books with titles like Do What You Love and the Money Will Follow, Find Your Calling, Love Your Life. It's not that simple. It's just not that simple. So actually having this reality check that even, if anything, it might make us feel better. We don't love our jobs every day necessarily, and that's okay. Nobody does.
Right. So with that, and I think you've already answered this to a certain degree, but can you describe for our listeners what most of your research has been focused on? So as you're talking about this.
So I'm trying to understand what is the experience of someone who feels a strong calling toward their work. And that's been for the better and maybe surprisingly also for the worse. So I'm just trying to really elucidate the complexity of the lived experience, I guess is what I would say.
And are there a variety of different fields that you've done this in?
Yes, there are. And so the common comparison that we do, Shasa and I do, and particularly in our work. So I should say calling scholars broadly love to look at really interesting and somewhat niche industries and occupations. So there's a very famous paper on zookeepers. There's a famous paper on animal welfare workers. And we're just sort of drawn to these, maybe highly, places we would expect to see a strong calling to get into that kind of work, though not everybody, right? But also that are maybe not as generalizable. And we realize the same thing goes for musicians and artists. So when we study musicians, but that is a very specific career path that doesn't necessarily bear obvious similarities to the typical office job. And then we're professors at business schools. So our typical comparison point is to business people, I would say, writ large, or to managers specifically, because that's a lot of who our students are training to be kind of business people and or managers. And so the general finding is that on average, the musicians and artists report stronger callings toward music and the arts than do business people and managers toward business and management. But that can be the actual experience of that can be a mixed bag. So one of the really strong positives toward experiencing a strong calling toward your work is that you are the sort of prototypical good employee in many ways. So employees with strong callings go above and beyond at work. They put their whole selves into their work, report zest for their work engagement, work satisfaction. And to the point where there's this sort of lay theory that these are, if we could screen for and only hire employees who feel strongly called, almost we should do that. And Shasa and I and two other co-authors did a meta-analysis where we looked at over 200 quantitative studies, empirical studies of calling, and found that experiencing a strong calling at work also leads to a feeling that overall you're more satisfied with your life. So sort of overall psychological well-being is linked to experiencing a calling toward your work. So that's very interesting, right? Finding deep meaning, fulfillment, and personal satisfaction at work kind of makes our lives better. And now you're wondering, but what could be the downside, right? Like this all sounds
It does.
so positive, right? And so then the downsides are kind of that it's been called a double-edged sword, or I like to think of it as two sides of the coin. On the one hand, you get all these benefits. And certainly if we were to think of the opposite of meaningful work, meaning work that feels meaningless or that I don't feel engaged in at all, or right? Like we wouldn't want anyone to have jobs that just feel like absolute drudgery, right? So I mean, there on some level, yes, I would like to encourage people to at least find work that does not feel, horrible day in and day out. But there's a double edge to the strong calling, which is that same mechanism that can lead people to be so engaged in their work can actually go too far. So it can become almost like an overcommitment or an obsession where a couple of interesting then things happen. So one is just this idea that I have to do this work at all costs. And sometimes those costs are literal. So the overall finding is that although we might expect these are the great employees who will be additionally compensated, the employees who have stronger callings for the work will do more to do that work even when they're not compensated. So in the zookeeper study, they're the ones who'll show up even on off hours. And there's a zookeeper in that study who says, my wife and I couldn't live on my salary alone. I don't do this for the money. It's just because my wife has a job that we're able to live.
That you're able to do this.
Yeah. Wow.
And we as society, we do kind of like, it's almost sanctioned to exploit people with strong callings because it's not about the money, it's about the love. And at what point do you take this maybe starving artist, metaphor or archetype too literally? I mean, when we think about the supporting orchestras for musicals who have gone on strike, the Hollywood writers who have gone on strike, it's seen as really surprising or distasteful. Again, they have these dream jobs, but also they're supposed to be in it for, and you even hear like these, studio bosses and people saying like, it's almost cheapens it. You're not supposed to be in it for the money. You're supposed to be in it for the creativity, but people still have to live, right?
Yeah. I just have to say that I can't tell you the number of gigs that I've worked that I played at for 3 hours where the servers at the tables made more money than I did.
Yep.
That the people who were just serving the meals and the drinks ended up coming away with more money than I did. And after a while, it gets to be kind of a pain.
Well, I think there's an interesting piece there as you talk about that, and we'll go back to musicians. I think this has shifted, but I remember the musicians that if they put a piece of music in a film or in a commercial, they sold out, quote unquote. And it was seen as a very negative thing. There were many years, like you couldn't earn money that way. You had to earn money because of record sales or whatever else. I think that has shifted and changed, but there are those attitudes that people hold about those types. And I can see it being in additional other areas as well that are around callings. Jen, before we dig down on some of that though, I want to go back to the very beginning of what you were just saying is that those people that find a calling in their work have a better, as the meta-analysis showed, that they had a better life satisfaction overall to some degree. What's the hypothesis that you took from that? Or is there a hypothesis around why that is? I mean, I can make up some things, but have you guys studied that or looked at that or thought about that at all?
Yeah. I mean, the basic mechanism, there's kind of two, and one is an internal mechanism and one is more external. So the internal mechanism is more about satisfying basic internal needs and desires for things like belongingness, achievement, affiliation, and just this sense of self-actualization that I am reaching maybe something like my purpose in living through this work.
Mm.
And again, it's not to say I want to, I want to kind of caution, because it's not to say this is the only way to feel like life is well lived or one is making a contribution. Many people work for money that fuels the contribution they make and the self-actualization they get outside of work. But what our study shows is that work is also a legitimate path to find that. And in fact, that the condition of searching for a calling. So I think there are some people who are like, work is work. It is what it is. I'm fine with that. That doesn't necessarily mean they're worse off. But if you have in your mind, I wish to have a calling toward my work and I can't figure out what it is or find it, that's a psychologically aversive state, because I think you feel like it's out there, but I can't get it. And then let me just talk quickly about the second mechanism is through a sense of societal contribution and societal validation. So basically feeling like the work that I do is making a positive contribution, pro-socially, helping others, maybe, helping specific others or society in general. And that is validating both through the actual good the work does, or my perception of the good the work does and the value in that, and also some level of social legitimacy that also society recognizes the value of my work, which in turn helps to make me feel recognized. Now, of course, it's hard not to also, though, when we talk about societal recognition, also acknowledge that typically the jobs that do the most good in our society are the least paid. So we do come back to, am I happier but less well off? I mean, it's hard. Again, it's hard to escape that conclusion or correlation, at least.
I mean, you can see that my son is now off in college, but he was on the ski team in high school and actually in junior high on the ski team for many years. And the coach, it was exactly as you talked about the zookeeper. The coach did that and worked, the hours that coach put in to help those kids, 100 plus kids every year, was immense. And he got paid nothing. And his wife, at the banquet every year, he thanked his wife to be able to do this because they wouldn't be able to live off of what he made doing the coaching. But that's very true. I mean, you think of teachers, you think of, nurses, you think of some of the other areas that probably are in your research that don't get the accolades or the necessarily even some of the pay that comes with that. So
that makes me think about is there a correlation between this kind of over exuberance and commitment and burnout?
Yes, absolutely. Good. So we didn't get to that because I was so hung up on the financial piece. But the other downside of experience, or one of the other common downsides of experiencing a strong calling toward work, is just that not being able to put the work aside when you return home at night. So not having a boundary between work and life, not being able to, disengage from work in a way that allows us to recharge, that ultimately does lead not only to burnout and sometimes even having to leave the line of work completely, but just a fatigue, an overexertion. There can be physical health issues that accompany experiencing a strong calling. It's an extreme, and so I think the benefits are amplified, and so too are the costs. And so, again, when we think about social work, nonprofit work, certainly coaching, I mean, it's such a good example, but, we feel so lucky when we see the hard work that people are doing. And sometimes we don't ask, is this sustainable?
Let's get back, if we could, just to a really basic thing. Can you define for our listeners what is a calling and what makes it different from I really love my work?
Yeah. So notions of calling date back to the Protestant Reformation, when a calling was from God explicitly to do at first clergy work. And then it was sort of broadened that all work that can serve God. So my work as a farmer could be, in the service of God. And this is very linked to this Protestant work ethic, idle hands are the devil's plaything, and all this sort of things. Now, today, certainly there are some people who would say, my calling is from God and it's my destiny and it comes from, I don't even know where, it's a source outside of me and I can't control it. But the way that I tend to talk about it and present it is much more secularized, right? So a higher power doesn't need to be involved at all. In fact, maybe I still don't really know where it came from, but I came to find that my work is a calling. I didn't necessarily always think it was my destiny. And Shasa and I, in our study, established a definition of calling, which is a consuming, meaningful passion that a person experiences toward a domain. That domain could be work. It doesn't have to. So, by the way, callings do not need to be toward, do not need to be toward work. I could feel a strong calling toward being a mother or being an environmentalist, even though I don't, my work is not environmental, for example. And that's, while I, as an organizational behaviorist, tend to study callings at work, that's what my area of interest is. It's really about a passion, something that gives your life meaning, something that you can't imagine not doing. It's almost, it's a central part of your identity, things like that.
So with that, and we'll geek out here a little bit, but from a research perspective, obviously when you're doing research, you need to measure a calling. How do researchers measure whether or not I feel like I'm doing work that is a calling for me versus, having to work with Tim on doing a podcast, and it's a grudgery thing every single day.
Right. Yeah. It's a grind.
Grind.
All the time.
The grudge probably a little too, just a grind. There you go. Yeah.
I can tell by the nonverbals that the listeners can't see that you guys hate your jobs a lot. You're having no fun.
Oh my
doing
gosh.
This podcast.
It's just horrible. If I had a better podcast co-host, I maybe.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, I'd rather be cleaning the kitchen right now, but.
What's funny is, right, a kid, given our ages, right, if as a kid you were like, I'm going to host this thing that's going to be, I bet the format hasn't even been developed yet, right? It's
yeah.
A calling to be a podcast host is kind of a funny thing. Maybe
No,
radio
it's insane.
announcer.
It's ridiculous. Actually, it's not
Maybe
just
a radio announcer or like David Letterman or something. I'm going to have a talk show, But anyway, so thank you for the question, Kurt. The way that we assess callings is by talking to people about their work. So that could be through an interview, or Shasa and I are one of many researchers who have tried to develop a scale measure. So scale items where people read these items, and they're things like, I am passionate about my work as a musician. My work in music is one of the first things that I talk about when I describe myself to others. My life is more meaningful because of my work in music. And I just, as someone taking, filling out this scale that could be included in something like a survey questionnaire, I would indicate my level of agreement with those statements. And so more agreement means a stronger calling. But I should say, the Zookeeper study and others, there are lots of good, strong research that's more about understanding the experience of calling and even what people have in their minds when they hear the word calling. In our scale measure, we never use the word calling specifically because we don't want to trigger, we want to define it. We don't want to trigger whatever people have in their heads about calling. But it's fascinating. I've talked to people who say, if a calling has to be from God, then I don't have a calling. And then sort of the opposite, right? I feel only that my calling comes from God, and anything else I don't believe in. So it's interesting how strong these lay theories, I guess, can be about what a calling is, where it comes from, and then sort of what it means to people.
I've been thinking about we've been talking about professions. We've been talking about people, the zookeepers, or I can just imagine like the men and women who are into grooming dogs. I mean, that is not a high paid job, and they do it. The exuberance that comes through when I get to meet them is tremendous. What about the amateurs? I'm thinking about amateur musicians specifically, because there's an old story in the amateur musician world that they take $5,000 worth of gear in a $500 car to a $50 gig. And, and how does a calling apply to the avocation, not the vocation?
So I love that. I've actually never heard that saying about amateur musicians. And like, I want to use that. That's phenomenal. So because we study musicians, it's almost impossible to avoid the case of the amateur. I mean, there are so many people out there who are almost would-be musicians who have day jobs, but then gig on the side, but it's not their primary, source of income. And we have studied these people. So the research would suggest that when we feel a strong calling, but we're not able to answer it occupationally, that's pretty bad for us, that basically we're much, worse off than we would be otherwise, because we feel feelings of frustration, regret, failure, and there's always the social comparison. Somebody else has made it and I haven't,
Case in point, Tim Houlihan. Yeah.
But so then it's a question of the amateurs sit in the middle, right? They could be considered better off than the people who are actually not gigging at all, or worse off than those who have made it. And so which one, I think that's why this group is particularly interesting, and which one overrides it.
Silver medalists, maybe?
Yeah. Well, so when we came into this, what we thought was they'd be exactly in the middle in terms of things like we have a study where we look at, for example, subjective well-being, how happy with their lives are these amateurs compared to either people who have left music entirely or are doing it professionally. We thought they'd be right in the middle, sort of statistically and otherwise. And what we found, and I'm sorry to say, it's a little depressing. They are more like the people who have left music entirely in terms of being not as happy as those who were able to gig. I mean, Tim, gig professionally, who are professional musicians. And our explanation for that is a bit, I still feel a little confounded by it. I still thought, because I feel like anecdotally, the amateurs I know are really happy. They really do focus on that upside of still engaging in the music. And I don't really feel like they're pining to be like, why am I in a cover band on the weekends? Why am I not Bono? That just doesn't even seem to, I don't get the sense they're thinking that. But I do wonder if there's something about, again, this notion of societal validation through earning a living, saying it's my profession, saying it's my occupation, and that if I experience a strong calling towards something I could be doing with the majority of my time, instead of having this day job, instead of having this lousy career as a podcaster. Now, but I don't know, Tim, how do you feel about keeping your music alive and what it sort of contributes to, or is it just complicated?
It's somewhat complicated, but I've found a way to make peace with all of that in such a way that I've still had plenty of gigs and released 7 records. And so I stay active. I still continue to create, and on a level that's not Bono, and that's okay. Yeah.
Jen, is there, and to that, is there any research, or have you found any evidence about people's age and their feeling around this? Because again, Tim, if you would have asked that same question when you were in your mid-20s, would have it been a very different answer than maybe in your mid-40s or where you are currently in your life right now?
It's such a good question, Kurt. Our respondents are in their mid-20s. I mean, that feeling of having not made it would still be quite acute. So this is like the follow-on study that we need to do as we're checking in with our respondents, again and again over time. But I think you're right. I think there is a just a coming to terms. I mean, as we age, right, we come to terms with a lot of things that are sort of, maybe never going to happen. And maybe that's a good thing. I mean, maybe it's we're even better off than had we, flamed out, early on and things like that. So I think just with age comes wisdom and perspective and all these good things. And so for our study, I think that could be a potential explanatory factor, is that they're still relatively young and therefore still relatively that feeling of failure is maybe more fresh. But I would think my working hypothesis would be very similar to yours, that over time, probably we would clarify one way or the other. We would either like really come to terms with it, or presumably if gigging and keeping the musician identity alive were actually psychologically damaging to us, we'd stop doing it. We just distance ourselves.
Yeah.
I would hope so. I would hope that it wouldn't get to be self-destructive, but I think that's a good question. Kurt, do you mind if I ask a more specific music question here?
Go for it,
Jen. So we've been talking about your research on musicians, of a whole variety of different professions for that matter, but we're also curious about your musical tastes. You talked about Tori Amos earlier, pretty amazing musician. But if you were to be stranded on a desert island for a year, so it might be self-indulgent. This might not be like a horrible thing. This could be self-indulgent. And you get to take 2 musical catalogs with you, 2 musicians, all of their work. Which 2 would you take with you?
Oh my gosh, this is what an unbelievable question that I feel utterly unprepared for. I have long thought that if I could bring a single album to a desert island, because I have done that hypothetical in my head, it would be Paul Simon's Graceland.
Oh,
wow. Yeah.
So maybe Paul Simon is my first answer, because if we're including Simon and Garfunkel and then
any of the work that Paul has been part of. So.
And Rhythm of the Saints. And I mean, I don't know. And then maybe we get Edie Brickell in there too, right? Like I'm just having a lot of
simply Simon, because he's married to Edie, right? So
Paul Simon and affiliated acts. That would be a hard one to. So Paul Simon. So first answer, Paul Simon. Let's see. I don't necessarily. Okay, I'm not going to say Tori Amos again. Who I am going to go for is the Indigo Girls. Are going to be my other.
I love that.
Because I have so many memories. So I've seen the Indigo Girls live in concert like a unbelievable number of times. Like because it feels like they tour a lot. So like every time they come through Boston, and I get together with my college roommates who we used to see them. I saw them so much in college. And actually, I want to give a shout out to my college roommate who still lives about a mile away from me now, my dear friend Andy, who is on the Indigo Girls back in like the just emerging internet days, was on this internet listserv that was for Indigo Girls fans. So she would write up like the set lists, and we actually made signs that friends held up and they got to sing on stage with the Indigo Girls.
Yeah, like Emily and Amy would actually interact with the listserv thing. Yeah. Okay, 100%. What's your favorite Indigo Girls show then, if you've seen them multiple times?
Oh my gosh. I mean, that's almost like impossible to answer, but it would have been, some they played at, all these kind of small colleges around Philadelphia when I was living there. And these shows were so, I don't know, they're like embedded in my soul as being these like most meaningful experiences. Yeah. And I'm curious, have either of you ever been to an Indigo Girls concert?
Yeah. I mean, I have a favorite. I've seen them several times, but I saw them once at at a Winnipeg Folk Festival and it wasn't their main show that they were doing. This was in like a little sort of a round robin sort of thing with a bunch of other musicians. And so they were just sort of playing around with different ideas, and they would ask, like Trombone Shorty was actually hosting the thing. And so he's asking, David Lindley, what do you think about this? And so he's going around to these fantastic musicians. And then at the end, he just turns to this group of 5 musicians and says, wouldn't it be kind of fun if we all just played one song together? And the crowd, there's like I don't know, 500 people, maybe a couple hundred people sitting around listening, and the crowd erupts, and the musicians on stage are like, "Yeah, let's do it." And he turns to Amy and Emily and says, "I would really be honored if we could all sing 'Closer I Am to Fine.'"
Oh,
And
I'm getting chills.
yes, it was that moment when all of them on stage had this incredibly visceral reaction, and we're all starstruck, even though they're all fantastic musicians in their own right. They sat back and just it was just one of the coolest experiences. And to be like 20 feet away from them on the grass was kind
Oh
of
my
pretty
God.
cool.
Well, that's what I was going to say, is that, there are these songs where every single person in the audience is singing the lyrics, and I can do that still to this day, right, with a couple of their songs. And it was so fun to watch Closer to Fine be featured in the Barbie movie and really have this like cultural moment, all over again from the 90s to today. It's just awesome.
Truly. We want to thank you so much, Jen, for being a guest on Behavioral Grooves today.
This was a delight. I mean, truly, this was amazing. I feel like I could talk to you both endlessly. So thank you.
Well, thank you for that nice compliment. And thank you. It was a great show. So. Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I share ideas on what we learned from our discussion with Jen, have a free-flowing conversation, and groove on whatever else comes into our good and bad calling brains.
The dichotomy, the great dichotomy, the great divide, the massive separation of the tectonic plates. I can see it.
Moses at the Red Sea.
Yes. Calling or not calling?
I don't know. So this is interesting because we've had some conversations about this subsequent to both of these conversations that we've had. And there is this upside to having your job be a calling.
Oh, yeah.
But there's also this potential downside for it. And it's really interesting when you think about what that implies for somebody. And as we've talked about, like, so do I just pursue my passion and just go for it? Or do I be more realistic and get that degree in accounting as opposed to going and being the actor out there? Like, your parents always said, gotta have that backup plan, right?
And by the way, this was a comment that I don't remember if it came up with Christopher or with Jen, but like, why is it that if you choose to pursue a career in the arts, like my son is a circus performer, and everybody asked, well, how old is he? And what happens if he gets injured? Like, what's his backup plan? It's like, fuck you. He's a performer. This is his job. This is his career. This is what he's doing. Like, why do you need a back? Like, nobody says that with somebody who's going off to do accounting. Well, what's your backup plan? What if he doesn't like accounting, or what if there's a layoff, or like, what the hell?
What if he breaks his leg and can't? I don't know.
What if he's injured in a car accident and can't do accounting anymore? Well, he'll figure it out.
Yeah, God. It's interesting how people do that, right? And there are certain professions that is obviously things, any kind of performance component, actor, musician, writer, all of those types of artistic kind of elements. Yeah. Those are the ones, right?
Well, why? I mean, there's just this part of me that, like, I just want to, I want to have all that drivel just go away, because it's their career. They, that most of these people, the vast majority of them, understand the boundaries and the limitations and the challenges that go with doing this kind of work.
Do you think that's it? That might be part of it, is this idea that, that person must be living in some dream world and Pollyanna about their opportunities and the chances of success. And so I'm just trying to put some realities, put some boundaries on this, and give them this thought about, what's your backup plan? Because we know most musicians don't ever make it big. Most writers aren't going to have that best-selling book. Most sports players aren't going to make it up to the major leagues. We know the base rates. And because of knowing those base rates, I don't think those base rates are quite the same in accounting. I get an accounting degree, I'm probably going to get an accounting job, right?
That's right. The base rates are better. But there's also, I think, that's a really good point, Kurt. I really like that. And I also think that working in tandem with that base rate idea is I was practical. I didn't do something stupid and pursue that. I didn't want to be a writer for television. I chose a practical thing. And so I'm now, the chief accountant in the accounting department of all accountants. And so,
my basking weaving passion, I gave up
in order to be practical,
to do my marketing degree. Yeah. Mm-hmm. There you go.
And so what, right? Like if, and again, this is getting back to, I don't believe that most artists or people who pursue artistic endeavors are under any illusions. I think that they fully understand the consequences. I can tell you this about my son and his compatriots. Like when they graduated from college, they knew exactly what they were getting into. They knew full well how difficult the road to a professional gig and gigs was going to be.
So even with that, I have a good friend, and actually we're going to need to interview him for our book, Finding Your Groove. But he, in his mid 50s now, is really getting into baseball umpiring, right? And he went and took a whole month off in January of 2024.
Of his practical day job?
Day job. He's an engineer. And he went down to a camp in Florida to study baseball umpiring. And he's, from the early April, or late March until the end of, actually it was into September, he is busy every weekend and on many nights umpiring baseball. But it was interesting because he said, when I was about 24 or 25, I also looked at this. And at that point, I turned it down. I realized that to get to the level I wanted to get to, it would have taken too much. And at this point, I think he's probably changed his expectations, which we can talk about later, about where he wants to go with this. He's not aiming to get into be an umpire at the MLB level or even the next layer down from Major League Baseball. But he is definitely high school and college, and those are his expectations now. So it's an interesting piece of, even throughout our lives, sometimes we might come back to this calling, even if we didn't pursue it at the beginning.
I think that that's a really interesting thing in part because he can. Yeah. Right.
In part because he did do the backup plan, and now he's set financially that they don't have to worry about making a living by his umping.
So there's a lot of complex things that are going into that, and that's okay. I don't think that is necessarily an argument for or against pursuing the calling from the start. But he did a calculation. I understand that calculation intimately, of getting to a point. I spent the summer of my sophomore year in LA, actually playing in bars and doing open mics and things like that, doing interviews with the record labels at the time, and came away from 3 weeks in LA going, I don't want to be in the music industry. These guys are assholes. Like everybody that I met with they were just horrible people. I didn't want to work with them on a professional level. I found that I felt really intimidated by the general quality of musicianship in LA at the time. I felt totally comfortable competing with, but the really, really good people, I didn't feel like I could compete with the very best. And so I wasn't really sure how much I had to offer. I got intimidated by that, and I said goodbye. I said, nope, I'm not going to pursue being a professional musician. And of course, 7 records later, I still love doing it.
And I think that's the interesting piece is, does your work become your calling, or does your work support your calling? And that can be an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
And then there's those of us who still aren't quite sure what our calling is. And that's a whole nother piece of this.
Okay, Captain
wonderful
Clueless.
Puzzle.
Right? Are you looking for a calling? I guess that's a question. Do you feel like there's one out there?
So this is an interesting piece, right? So we talked about, there's a bunch of upsides of having your work be calling, and Jen talked about those, right? You get this element of alignment of personal goals and work and various different things. You're really passionate about the work. You're doing really good work when it's your calling. You hopefully get some accolades for that. You get that, but there's the downsides, right? That you become overworked, that you, this becomes the be all end all, and you don't have any of the other elements within your life that give it richness and fulfillment and all of those pieces. It becomes this one overriding arching thing. And for many people, it's with this idea of getting to be at this pinnacle. And oftentimes we don't reach that pinnacle. As much as hard as we try, as good as we are, to your point, you could be a really, 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 really good musician, and that might not be enough.
Right.
Right. That
That's
might
right.
not be enough, even if you dedicated your entire, 8 to 15 hours day working at this and moving it forward and dealing with the assholes, as you said, and making that try to happen. It still might need be enough, because oftentimes there's an element of luck involved. Oftentimes there is just,
absolutely,
the other talent is just so much better that I don't have the natural inclination or maybe the mindset to be able to spend 15 hours a day on this. And I just can't do that. So those are real things. But that does not mean, and Jen said this, and I'm going to try to quote here, is that you can't at least find work that isn't horrible, that you're not dreading going into work every single day because it's horrible, right? And here I'll quote, I'd like to, this is what Jen said, I would like to encourage people to at least find work that does not feel horrible day in and day out. That is something I can definitely align around.
Right. Well, and we know that from business observations that when someone is passionate about something, when they care about something, when they have some unique personal interest or intrinsic motivation about a topic or a particular role, they're going to be better at it than the people who are just taught how to do that. Like, you can learn the skills, but if you have that natural inclination towards something, especially if it's passion, that adds to likely to your success. And at the very least, your job satisfaction and life satisfaction, your general well-being is better because you're doing something like that.
Right. And on that, I think Jen brought up this really interesting part, is that she said the research suggests that when you feel a strong calling, but you're not able to answer it occupationally, that's pretty bad for us.
Yes.
Right. And that was a quote. I read that.
That was very nicely done.
Yeah. But it's this idea that if you can't follow that calling, then it's worse off than we would be otherwise, because you feel frustrated, you feel regret, you feel this failure. It's this element of what could have been. And I go back to my friend Paul, the umpire piece. And I don't think that, like, at 24, if he thought this was a calling, right? But callings also change throughout our lives. And I think it might have become more of a calling, that it was lying in the back of his brain, growing slowly over time. It was being fed. And then you see these things going on, and then the opportunity presented itself, and he is grabbing at it.
So 2 things about that. One is the idea that to what degree we pursue these callings, to what degree we're willing to put effort into it. I think that's an important aspect of this discussion, is going all in versus going most of the way in or part of the way in or a little bit in. Using Paul as an example, pursuing being an umpire when he was in his 20s, he got to a certain point where it didn't work for him. And he wasn't so far into it that he couldn't pull himself out and go and do something else.
Yeah.
So, and this was part of the problem with the guy in New York who took his piano down to Washington Square Park and ended up playing so much in Washington Square Park that he became homeless, right?
Yeah.
Because he lost all of his income sources and lost his apartment and all that kind. Like that, for me, that's a level of obsession that is sort of beyond the pale. Like you kind of have to be willing to say that was just too much. And you got to find something that works. Your groove is finding your groove. The other thing about that is the matchup that you indicated. If your calling comes and goes, or if it changes over your life, you owe it to yourself to continue to check in with who you are.
Yes.
That knowing thyself is not a static check the box. I did it when I took that career assessment when I was 21 years old, and
boom.
I should have been a forest ranger. God damn it. But I didn't. So, you got to continue to check in with yourself and ask, who am I today? Who am I? And then process the world through where I'm at.
And we hear the stories of these elite athletes, elite musicians, the ones that make it big. And they talk about this full dedication and what it required of them to do this. And the interesting piece for me is, yes, it's a kind of blinders on focus 100% on my passion, but it's this survivorship bias that we have.
Yes.
Just because you do that does not mean that you will get to that pinnacle.
That's right.
And so there's a realism that I think is oftentimes people are deluded. And I think that's okay for a while. There is this idea that, when you're a young kid, right? And you ask, are you an artist or are you a sports player? Kids do.
Well, you're talking about like 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds,
4, 5, 6, 7. They yes, I am, and I can be an NBA player, and I'm going to be, a musician.
Astronaut.
I'm going to be an actor. I'm going to do all of these things, and then they get tempered. And I think there's some value in not tempering those right away.
Mm-hmm.
That this false belief that maybe it's not false, that I can be whatever I want to be, is very invigorating,
mm-hmm.
and allows people to maybe go further than they could otherwise. I think there needs to be at certain check-in points that we assess. Is this realistic? Can I do this? And what are the expectations that I have?
Yeah.
And I think we've talked about this. There's a world full of amateur musicians, artists, jocks, actors, right? Some are happy with that amateur status, and some are not.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this potential frustration of comparing yourself to others who have achieved that pinnacle and you haven't.
Yeah.
And you always think to yourself, well, if I would have just practiced that much more, if I would have just put myself out there that much more. And that's not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Before there's one other thing I wanted to cover and talk about, and that is sort of this disconnect between the societal perceptions of what dream jobs are and sort of the realities of those occupations. But before we go there, Kurt, I was just thinking about Nina Simone. And, a lot of people know Nina Simone as this sort of civil rights kind of a singer, right? Like she helped usher in the civil rights movement. She's a fantastic pianist. It has a distinctive voice. And wrote some really challenging anti-racial anthems, basically. But, she started her life as a professional. She started her life as a professional classical pianist. Okay. She went to Juilliard. Like she was bent on just being a piano player of classical music. And it wasn't until 1963, I think it was, when Medgar Evers was assassinated in Mississippi, that she kind of had this like wake up call, like, wait a minute, what is going on? Like, I'm Black and I have this, I might be targeted because I'm Black, for trying to do something in a white world. Like there weren't any, she didn't have any role models as Black classical pianists. And she morphed, she changed her dream job from being a classical pianist into being sort of this performer who sang songs and she wrote songs about the civil rights movement that happened over the course of just a year or so. That was dramatic, so like she morphed in a way that maybe from the outside, it might look like, well, she was still a musician, but that was a dramatic change for her to go from thinking I'm a classical pianist to being I'm a singer-songwriter about race issues.
And
that was huge.
I think what you bring up is a really important part that we talked about earlier. Your calling, your passion is not static.
Right.
Can and should morph. This idea that you take your work inventory test at 18 and you are set for life is a falsehood. The idea too that I can start off with a calling and my dream job as those musicians that Jen talks about. And then you get into the day-to-day of it, and it might not meet the expectations that you had, and it becomes a grind. And that needs to then shift as well. So maybe being, first chair in the Boston Symphony Orchestra isn't what I really is going to give me joy and passion for my life.
Well, it wasn't everything that it was cracked up to be. It's not what I had all these expectations about what that job was going to be. And it turns out that when I was getting there, it wasn't that job.
Right. And I know in our little work on finding your groove, this idea that we are expanding upon and writing a book about, one of the things that we talk about is this continuous self-discovery, this idea that we are on this constant, ever-evolving journey, that today is different than yesterday and tomorrow will be different than today.
Yeah.
And as much as we like to think that we're the same, we're not. And those changes might be small, and they are most of the time. They are insignificant in a day over day change. But it's those small, insignificant changes that happen over time that change the course of our life. And we can either realign with those changes or we become disconnected from it. And that's where you fall out of your groove.
Yeah. I don't have anything else to say about that. That's pretty fantastic.
So, right. We wrap it up there. So this was pretty cool. We wrap up two separate conversations on one book about the meaning of work. And I'm glad we got to talk to Christopher and Jen. It wasn't going to always happen. Christopher and Jen were supposed to show up together. Something happened. Jen couldn't make it. And then we had the conversation with Christopher and we said, no, we want to have this conversation with Jen as well because we found it so appealing. Plus, she had some additional work that we brought in too. So that was cool.
Yeah. I loved getting the philosophical perspective. I'm sure you did too, because you're basically a philosopher at heart, Kurt. I know that. Or not.
I just don't understand philosophy. It goes above my head.
I love the conversation with Christopher. I loved the conversation with Jen. Also, for all of the work that she's done with musicians was super cool, but it's very research based. And that was very appealing to me as well.
Yeah, we got the double bonus, right? That was cool.
Yeah.
And I'm 100% in alignment with you. That philosophical bent versus that more research psychology bent. I think those two combinations really present this from two different perspectives that hopefully our listeners, I know for me at least it did, made me think about this in very different ways. Yeah. And I'm hoping that's valuable for people.
With that, Groovers, we hope that you keep this calling, this work, career, job, calling thing in mind as you go out this week and use it to help you find your groove.